Hello there. The question before us tonight, who was the best British boxer of all time? It's a question that's vexed greater minds than mine. I hope our distinguished guests can help provide me with some answers over the next hour or so. Over the years, British boxing has produced some great names, household names, and people who've got a special places in the hearts of the British public at large. Frank Warren, the leading fight promoter in Britain today, is with me. So too Glenn McCrory, a colleague of mine on Sky Sports. Delighted to have Glenn with me. And also Harry Mullen. It's a pleasure to welcome the boxing correspondent of The Independent on Sunday. Harry, first for you, how would you define the standards that we're going to use here?
Well, I think we have to look at the whole career and not just at isolated fights. I mean, if you did it just on one fight or in two fights, you might get quite surprising results. I mean, if you did that in world terms, you would have Buster Douglas as a possible all-time great heavyweight champion, because on that one night he hit the heights. There have been similar cases in British boxing history, but I think we have to look at the overall career, at the durability, the length of the career, the quality of the opposition that they faced, and the success rate that they had against people who were acknowledged as great fighters in world terms.
Frank, I mentioned that part of the outstanding achievement of some of these sportsmen is that they've endeared themselves to the British public, so they don't necessarily have to be world champions in order to do that, do they?
No, but I think that if you're talking about the best British fighter of all time, he must be a world champion, because that's the highest level. And I think there've been some guys along the way who've just not done it. But you've got to look at the end of the day at a guy becoming a world champion, because that's the ultimate.
I should have also mentioned that as a former world champion yourself, Glenn, you'd probably go that route as well. Is that fair?
Yes, I think so, and I think also longevity as a champion's got to come into in who they're facing. Also, it's very difficult when we're talking about fighters from quite a while ago, because I just go back about 30 years, and obviously what you've seen is what you believe, and it's very difficult to believe so much in the legend if you haven't really seen it.
Harry, if we turn back to the start of the century, one of the biggest stars in British or world boxing was Bob Fitzsimons, and he had a special place, certainly in British boxing history, as whichever century he really belongs to, one of the few British fighters to compete on level terms at world level.
Well, first of all, I would dispute Fitzsimmons being British at all.
Okay.
By an accident, always a controversial view. He was born in Cornwall, certainly, in Helston, but he emigrated at quite an early age to New Zealand. He learned his boxing in New Zealand and in Australia, and was an American citizen by the time he became a world champion. So I don't think his claim, or Britain's claim to him, is anything other than an accident of birth.
All right. How good was he, Harry?
Well, it's impossible really at this distance in time to judge the quality of fighters at the turn of the century, because your only means of assessing them is through very poor quality old flickering black and white films, and through the contemporary accounts, and the people writing at the time had got no Joe Louis to compare them against, or Rocky Marciano or Muhammad Ali. I mean, this whole exercise, it's a bit like looking up old girlfriends, isn't it? You know, that they're never quite as pretty or as exciting as you remember them. And whenever you look at the old fight films, it can spoil your illusions.
I think this game's a little bit harder, actually. And tell me, from your extensive knowledge of the period, was it a harder game back then than it is today?
Oh, certainly it was, of course. I mean, there were none of the controls or the safeguards or the medical standards that there are nowadays. Fights could go on 45, 50 rounds routinely, and it was a game for hard men.
Britain did very well in this period before the First World War, Glenn, in the low weight divisions in terms of producing world champions. Frank thinks this is a yardstick we should use. Ted Kid Lewis had a long and distinguished reign as a world champion in the welterweight division.
I think his record on paper is going to be very hard to beat. He went on for a very long time. I think he had, with just one opponent at world level, he had 20 fights. I think that was Jack Britton. And he fought so many times. He had a wonderful, long and prestigious career. But again, it's difficult to really judge him, because the evidence is in seeing him, and that's the thing with all fighters. The same with Jimmy Wilde, who was a great old fighter, the ghost with the hammer in his hands, because he was such a little guy, just a flyweight, but yet he could knock big men out. So that's the difficult thing, having not seen them. But there was so many fighters around in them days, and they were literally fighting almost weekly.
Well, 280 or more in the case of Lewis, Frank.
That's right. I mean, he obviously is. I think all these guys, we haven't seen them, but the bottom line of all it, in those days, they were really, really tough days. And these guys fought sometimes twice a week. Now, I couldn't imagine a modern day boxer doing that. Just couldn't see it happen.
Twice a month is not acceptable by our
sorry,
standards.
twice a month.
Yeah.
Twice a month. But I couldn't imagine that a modern day boxer doing that. So they must have been real tough guys, and the refereeing standards were certainly not as good in those days. And when you look at Jimmy Wilde, and bearing in mind people were smaller in those days, they weren't big guys, they weren't, you know, there were more small people about. I think Jimmy Wilde has got to go down as being one of the greats. I think he was a champion for around 7 years, and you know, and travelled and won the title abroad and so forth. So you know, I think he is an outstanding candidate.
We should perhaps point out, Harry, that for fighters of this era, travelling was such a much greater deal than it would be today.
It was virtually unheard of
Yeah.
for a top quality fighter to go to America. And I can think offhandedly of Freddie Welsh and Ted Kid Lewis of that era who made their careers over there. But one of the difficulties of assessing people like Lewis is the number of no-decision contests that they had. I mean, at that time in America, it was illegal to give a verdict at the end of a fight, and bets were settled on the opinion of a newspaper reporter, which was not always the most reliable.
How extraordinary, yeah.
So there may well have been a lot of fights on Lewis's record where, had a verdict been given, the verdict may well have gone against him, and that may have coloured our view of him now as a great fighter. I mean, obviously he was, and I'm not at all attempting to denigrate what he did, but it is difficult to get a completely accurate picture of his achievements.
Frank touched on perhaps a very important point. This period in British history where there was such social poverty and social deprivation produced, especially in the Jewish community in London,
Well,
a whole
all
string of
ethnics,
top fighters.
but that's what happens with most with all boxing. The ethnic minorities always seem to come through because they're struggling financially and as you say, socially. I think the thing is, you know, with these guys, they used to have to make weight in those days. There was no junior weights like us today, where you could, you know, there was junior featherweights, and then, you know, you go up to lightweight. You just went you know, 7 pounds in weight in between, and that you've got to take into consideration as well. These guys really had to struggle to make the weight.
Jack Kid Bird.
Well, it was just if I could pick up that point of Frank's in relation to Kid Lewis, he was the world welterweight champion, yet he fought for the European heavyweight title.
Amazing.
I mean, think of you know, Kevin Lushing fighting Frank Bruno or something. It just doesn't work, does it? But that's what he did. I mean, that's the measure of what kind of a fighter he was.
How about Berg?
Berg was a wonderful fighter. I mean, he would be right up there in my top 3 or 4 of all-time British fighters, because Berg, like Ken Buchanan, was a man you could send anywhere in the world to do the job, and he would deliver the goods. He went to America, he beat the best around, he beat Kid Chocolate, who'd never been beaten in something like 70 fights at the time. He won a world title from a good American, Mushy Callahan. He defended it in America perhaps, I don't know, 15 times, a colossally busy champion. And his career went on and on and on. I mean, he fought for something like 25 years and was still a good fighter at the end of it all.
Did the fighters in these lower weight divisions at that time get a bigger share of the limelight and the money available in boxing than
very
today?
much so in Berg's era. I mean, there was a great generation of lightweights at that time, with Tony Canzoneri and Barney Ross, and you know, it was a great time to be a lightweight, and Berg was one of the
Which bears out what you were saying, Frank, about it being a much more competitive environment.
I think it was more competitive days because there were more fighters. Today, conditions as far as fighters are concerned, there are not that many fighters around. In Britain, for example, I think about 800 pros. I would think there were a good 4,000 or 5,000 in those days, at least that much.
You can be fighting for a world title fight when in 10, 15 fights nowadays. But then you 70, 80, you know, so many fights before you even got into recognition. You really had to fight your way to be recognised.
That's true, but you only had, it was getting the opportunity of fighting for the title. Again, the politics coming into being there. You know, a lot of guys didn't get the opportunity because of they weren't with the right camps.
Well, there were only 8 champions in 8 weight divisions then. There was no WBC, WBA, IBF. I mean, it was just the one guy. So
Glenn, more closer to your heart, perhaps the bigger weight divisions, former cruiserweight yourself, the light heavyweights.
Well, I think you've got to speak about Freddie Mills, who had a very good career. In more modern terms, John Conte, who did so very well as well.
But specifically thinking about this pre-war and war years
again,
period.
Fighters like Tommy Farr, who went out and boxed Joe Louis and had such a wonderful fight with him. That, you know, that was a marvellous performance. And Len Harvey, who claimed a version of the world title, and who boxed, I think he went from middleweight to heavyweight as well, and fought for so long in a prestigious career. So they were all, you know, in a long era fighting in such high competition, you know, so many fights.
Harry, how was it that the Americans came to dominate the heavier weight divisions at the expense of fighters from Europe?
Basically because our guys weren't good enough. It's as simple as that. You know, if you look at the records of Len Harvey and Jock McAvoy, Tommy Farr, They all lost, you know, when they went in with good American fighters. Tommy Farr fought 5 times in America after fighting Lewis and lost them all. Len Harvey was beaten by Marcel Till in a middleweight title fight and by John Henry Lewis in a light heavyweight title fight. So they just fell short. They were great British fighters, great domestic fighters, but once they were asked to make that final little step onto the world stage, they didn't quite manage it.
Right, before we draw this part of the